the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light."
So we are starting a new series on the book of Genesis, or more specifically on the first 3 chapters of Genesis called In the Beginning. And we also have a class that we're going to offer taught by myself tomorrow. So the sermons are going to give you kind of an insight and hopefully you get some good nuggets. But if you're really curious, if it sparks some interesting things that you're like, boy, I want to learn more about this, we have a Genesis class tomorrow, starting tomorrow at 6 p.m. here at this building. So again, anybody's welcome to come to that. So if you're like, boy, I have more questions after these sermons that you didn't get any answers for, just come on down and we'll talk more about it in the class. But I'm excited to dive into this. This is, honestly, I'm a pretty big Bible nerd. This is the nerdiest thing about me. Is Genesis 1 through 3. I just think there is so many things in these 3 chapters that we just don't understand, that we don't always appreciate. I think there's been a lot of misinterpretations within these 3 chapters, and we're going to really work on untangling a lot of that, but also just looking at some of the beauty that is in these 3 chapters. And I had a seminary teacher who taught us this idea, and I really like it, and I want to share it with you. But he asked the question, anytime he walked in, if what I believe isn't true, do I want to know it? He asked the question, if what I believe wasn't true, would you want to know it? And I think that's a great question, especially for a bunch of seminary students who think they know everything already, right? I thought that was probably the greatest question, and it really challenged me. Like if someone gave me a different idea, would I really care to look into it? Would I really care to allow it to change my life? Now, this pointed question forced me to engage more with curiosity and a willingness to be wrong. And I think this is a great way that we should always approach Scripture. And this will change the way you really study the Word as a person, is when you come and sit before the Bible, do you go, boy, if I'm wrong, I want to know it. I want to be taught with curiosity and willingness to be wrong. This led me into deeper understanding, refreshing insights about who God is. I still learn a great deal by asking this question, just by sitting with people every day. In this series, I want to invite you to ask the same question to yourself. Maybe you came with your own presuppositions about what these 3 chapters in Genesis do or saying and look like. But ask yourself, if what I believe isn't true, do I really want to know it? Am I willing to be curious about what these teachings say? Hopefully, this will also lead you in a deeper understanding and a new, refreshing view of one of our most ancient stories. A new and refreshing view of one of the most ancient stories. Within these 3 chapters of Genesis, there are 140 indirect or direct references to just these 3 chapters in the Old and New Testament. 80 of them coming from the New Testament. 80 times these 3 chapters we're going to study are directly or indirectly referenced in those teachings. It's imperative that we understand it. This is where the beginning of understanding the common threads, the beauty of things, the imagery, the mosaic of Scripture, these are the beginnings of those areas that we have to understand. It's imperative, or else we're going to miss some of the richness and beauty of the biblical writers as they're looking back into these 3 chapters. As Jesus himself references these 3 chapters, we have to understand these well. And my goal in this series is to help you see these threads that are found throughout Scripture, that are often what we like to call hyperlinked. These little hyperlinks, if you guys are computer nerds, you understand what a hyperlink is, where you push it on a link and it takes you back to a different link. There's so many of that where the hyperlink is in these first 3 chapters. These links draws us and drop us into a level of Scripture that brings with it tremendous beauty as it reveals even more of the goodness of God, which is what we're going to look at through these next 4 weeks, these things that point to the goodness of God. So let's start with understanding Genesis. How do we look at it? How do we posture ourselves in a position to understand the beauty within these 3 chapters? Well, I recently took my kids bowling for the first time, not too long ago, and they weren't very good, as you can imagine. And so we put the bumpers up for them. Clearly, it was for them. They needed the bumpers, so we put bumpers up. And, it helped. I didn't want to discourage them. I didn't want them, for their first experience really bowling, to be a discouraging experience for them. I didn't want them to gutter ball every time and just give up. So we put up bumpers to keep them on course, help them to want to actually keep playing again. And I think the Bible can be this way sometimes, especially when you open it in your first 3 chapters, you're like, I have no idea what's happening. There's naked people running around in a garden. There's, third day is somewhere around, you just don't understand the concepts that are happening. It's hard. And I think it can be very confusing, discouraging. We kind of pass through it. We're like, let's get to something like a story or a narrative. You kind of fast forward to maybe Abraham a little bit or maybe to Noah. And you're just sort of looking for something to grab hold of. And I think that's really simple to do. And so I want to start by laying up some bumpers for us. Let's put some guardrails in so that we can understand, okay, how do we stay on course? How do we understand this in a way that helps to encourage us to understand what's happening in these passages? Let's keep on track where we'll find great joy in our truth of our exploration of Scripture here. And the first bumper I want to talk about is this. The Bible is an ancient text, and one that was written to us, or when it was not written to us, but for us. The Bible is an ancient text, not written to us, but for us. This might surprise you. You are not the original audience of these stories, right? The first speakers, the stories we're going to study were more oral traditions at first, especially if you look at the Hebrew, they rhyme, they're poetic, they were meant to be memorized, much like the Iliads and things like that in our Greek cultures were supposed to be this way. And so we're talking about something that has been passed down for 4,000 plus years to us today. We have to start with the bumper that this was not something that was written to us. We are not the original audience here. And it's imperative to understand this. And many of us might think of it, well, that's pretty intuitive, but we don't always apply it that way, do we? We don't always apply it as someone who is an ancient audience. There's a temptation when reading Genesis 1 through 3 to filter our reading through our own modern lenses. There's a temptation to do that. In fact, I think it's a natural thing to do. Anytime you read something, you're filtering it through your own biasness. You're filtering it through your own experiences. That's just part of the human experience. And so we have to be aware that we do that, and so we can allow ourselves to meet the text where it's supposed to be. For example, attempting to make it fit our own scientific worldviews, rather than allowing it to speak for itself in the perspective of the ancient people, is something that happens especially in Genesis 1, where we try to filter it through our own scientific modern worldview and not really allowing it to speak in its ancient world. This might mean we have to work hard to understand the Bible, and this is where some people get discouraged because they realize, why can't I just sit down and read it and understand it? I wish it was that easy. In fact, Paul will tell Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15, he says, be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a worker who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. He says, be diligent. Work hard at understanding the word of truth. It's not always an easy thing to do. You have to spend time to understand it. I think as a kid, I used to be like, all right, God will just tell me exactly what I need to know through this. And sometimes he does. But there's also times where he's like, you're going to have to work to understand this stuff because you're not the original audience. You are reading someone's emails from 4,000 years ago. It's going to take a little bit of work, right? Again, there are 4,000 years between us and the minds that first recited these passages. But we have the same inspirational God. That's the thing, is God is speaking to these people in their own world, in their own ways, but we are benefiting from it. There are still things, when we work hard, when we see the beauty that's happening in their own context, we can pull from that and we can see some great beauty that fits our world today. Again, it takes diligent work to understand how these people thought, what they thought about their world, what their context was like to live in. Again, these people are completely foreign to us, but are telling us something really important about the God we believe in today. These foreigners from basically a distant land and a different culture, almost from a different planet, are telling us something that is really important for us today. So this series may bump up against some of your own preconceived notions, and that's good. I don't want you to always feel comfortable here. I want you to feel a little uncomfortable sometimes when you have to wrestle with things that you didn't know or growing up with, and you kind of have to go, well, that's not how I first learned it. Good. You're learning something new then. That's good. You might run into some of that through this, because we're going to view it from the perspective of Bronze Age Israelites, not 21st century Americans. I think that's how we should always view these chapters, is how are we thinking about this from the ancient perspective. One of my favorite scholars, Tim Mackey, is the lead scholar of the Bible Project. He says this about these chapters. He says, we all have an essential view of the universe, how it was formed and our place in it. And intentionally or unintentionally, our views shape how we read the Bible, including, and particularly, Genesis 1 through 3. It is helpful to be aware of our preconceived assumptions as we approach Scripture. So what are our preconceived notions when we approach Scripture? How are we thinking about these stories that might interfere with how we stay on track here? We must meet the ancient writers not with our own preconceived assumptions, but instead take seriously their words by meeting them in the context. And this is one of my favorite things I learned from seminary was I learned how to take the Bible seriously. Seriously. This is really, we take it seriously when we meet them in their own world, when we meet them in their own context, when we take the time to study those areas. So bumper number 1, the Bible is an ancient text and one that was not written to us, but for us. Bumper number 2, on the other side, the Bible uses ancient cosmological language, not modern cosmological language. Cosmology is just how we think about the universe. So in essence, we're asking, how did the ancients think about the world around them? How did they look up into the stars and go, hey, what's that? And they came up with a cosmology. That's going to be different than our 21st century American cosmology. And guess what? 4,000 years from now, cosmology might be different again. I hope it is. It probably will be. The cosmological questions we ask the Bible to answer or bring to our reading of the Bible play a major role in how we come to our interpretations. You know, a few of the things you'll see nowadays within these especially the first chapter, you'll say, well, this is all talking about the age of the earth. Again, that is a modern interpretation of these passages. Maybe how God created everything scientifically. Again, a modern assumption. We have to ask ourselves, are these the questions that the authors in the Bronze Age are asking? Are these the questions they're trying to answer with these texts? And I'm not saying these aren't good questions. We should ask these questions. I've taught on these questions. I've done podcasts on these questions. These are good questions, and you can answer them. I think it is simple enough for Christians to look into the universe and go, where is God in all of this? I mean, that's a good question, and Christians should be asking that question. But is that the question that the Genesis authors are asking? Is what I'm trying to get to. We need to understand, again, their own context. How were they thinking about these things? Because the authors of Genesis aren't answering these types of modern scientific, material, ontological questions. Our modern cosmology was not going to be the same as it was 4,000 years ago. One example of that is our modern scientific worldview tends to be more what's called material ontology, which just means origins that base off of material. Whereas the ancient world was more of a functional ontology. What does it mean to function when it comes to origin? So if I use my podium, for example, if a modern viewer might look at this podium and go, well, it originated when you got the material for the base, you got material for the table, you put it together, you put the screws in it, it was sitting in the warehouse. That's when it was the origin story of the podium. That might be the material. You're thinking about what it's made of. But an ancient author or an ancient thinker would go, it may have materialized in the warehouse, but it really didn't function until somebody came and stood behind it and preached for it from the first time. That's when it originated. And so we have one focus. The modern focus is more on the material, the makeup, the things that create the podium, whereas the ancient writer is thinking more, how did this function? When was it actually put into practice and the purpose of it began to work? That is when it originated. We have to think about these things as we try to understand these passages, that we're talking about a functional ontology, not a material ontology. In Genesis, we get functional ontological questions, not material ones. But again, I still believe God created everything materially. It's just a different question. We're trying to answer the question and look at the question from the basis of the Genesis authors. And what they're thinking about would be the difference between a house and a home. What they're trying to describe is a home and not a house. Do you guys see the differences between the connotations? It's a subtle difference between these two connotations, but we can often assume that God is trying to build a house in Genesis 1. Well, you have the gutters, you have the framing, you have all the material that make up the house. And we get kind of fixated on this material ontological perspective of Genesis 1, this materialized. We think, boy, the physical structure that makes up the house must be what they're talking about in Genesis 1, because that's how we think about origins and creation. We assume material ontology. We ask questions that might be around more the Big Bang Theory or creatio ex nihilo, which is the creation out of nothing. Again, stuff that I've taught, things that I affirm. But again, we filter our own Genesis 1 through our modern cosmology. However, if you were to ask and sit in a circle with a bunch of Hittites, Babylonians, Israelites, Egyptians, and you were to say the word earth, when we read earth in verse 1, and you thought of this picture I have somewhere coming up. There it is. If you were to show them this is our modern view of earth. We recognize that we know it. They'd say, what is that fungus moldy blueberry doing here? They would have no clue what this is. They've never seen this. They don't know. They don't have an outside perspective of the earth. Right? We have to go, well, what do they think when it says earth? What do they mean when it talks about land? I think what they're talking about more is a home. A home. The authors of Genesis want to teach us more about what it means to be home than it does a material ontology of a house. Home has a more broader emotional meaning and a deeper function. Where someone feels at home is a sense of belonging, comfort, attachment. We might say, I'm going home for Christmas. When I say I'm going home from Christmas, I'm not thinking about, I can't wait to see the gutters, and I can't wait to see the roof tiles, and all the material of the actual house. Like, maybe you're a nerd and you think that way, I don't know. But for me, when I say I'm going home for Christmas, I can't wait to see my family. I can't wait to sleep in the bed, my own bed. I can't wait. There's other things that we're attached to. You feel at ease, belonging, comfort, regardless of the physical structure. Or we even use in our own terminology, we have a dysfunctional home, which I think the Genesis author would absolutely understand that. Dysfunctional home. We hope that it works and becomes something we can function in. What we will see through Genesis 1 and 3 is that the text wants to teach us more about what it means to be at home than it does about the house. So often we get too fixated on what the house is rather than the perspective of he's trying to show you this is what it means to be home. So to understand it, we need to look past our modern cosmological debates and arguments and allow the text to breathe in its own world. Just let the text breathe rather than taking it bleeding out of its own context to try to make it say something because it fits your paradigms. I don't live in other people's paradigms. I just don't play in those sandboxes. I really want to understand what the original authors and thinkers were doing here. So let's lay our modern cosmology down for just a moment. Not saying those aren't important and we shouldn't talk about those things, but right now we're going to lay it to the side. We're going to lead our modern understandings and assumptions about these texts to the side for just a moment, and we're going to enter into the world of 4,000 years ago. A world that is completely foreign to us and a world that has some profound things to say about God. And we're going to focus again on what the Lord is teaching us in these opening lines of Genesis 1. You guys ready? You got your bumpers on? Good. So let's start with our opening line here. Genesis 1 through 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was a formless and desolate emptiness. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So let's break this down, because I'm sure many of you have read this. I don't even know how many times. Every January 1st, somebody reads this passage. It's all your yearly Bible plans, right? And you guys stick through it, right? I never make it past March, usually. So I've read this passage more times than I even know. So let's look at it line by line here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning is the Hebrew word bereshith. Bereshith. It's the Hebrew version of saying a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This is the Hebrew version of that. what we're getting there is an origins account. It's saying we're talking about something that happened a long time ago in an origin account. This is how, if you looked at other ancient Near Eastern writers, which is how we understand a lot of these, you understand this is what they're saying. They're talking about a particular origin account, and a lot of cultures around Israel had origin accounts. Israel is no different than this. They're just giving a different one than what you might see in Egypt, Babylon, Arcadia, Hittites, the worlds that are around them. Again, I like to imagine they're all sitting in a circle and they're all sharing. This is how the universe got created, and then the Israelite comes up and gives their take on the origin story. And then it says, God created the heavens and the earth. And again, we have to kind of untangle our understandings, because when we hear heaven, we think of this disembodied place of glory that is, somewhere where you go when you die. But really the word here is just skies, or more literally, the space up here. He created the space up here and the earth. Again, we're not thinking of the moldy blueberry, right? We're thinking of the land. It literally just means the space down here. So the Israelites saying there's space up here, God created that. And the space down here, God created that too. Pretty simple, right? Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the word there for created is different than anything else you'll see. The word there is bara, and it's 100% only ever used for God. I cannot bara. Humanity cannot bara. Any other entity outside of God does not bara. So this is where the Israelite is saying something extremely interesting by using this terminology, by saying that God created it. A Hebrew word reserved only for God. It's never used in connection to anything else, and it's in the opening line about God. What he's saying here is we live in a space where God is the author, creator, and architect. He's the one that is forming our home. He is the one who forms the home by his own spoken word and gives us space to dwell. Now, this might seem super simple, and you're like, yeah, I already knew this. But when you contrast this with the stories that are around Israel, it's amazing. To appreciate it fully, we have to look at how it compares to the origin stories in the circle that they're sitting in. Because again, the Israelite culture was not born in a vacuum, right? They're bumping into, they know these other accounts of these other people. But they're trying to say something really unique to these Akkadians, Egyptians, Babylonians, etc. Because their cosmology might be similar, but what the Israelite is trying to say stands in stark contrast to what their stories are. Because most of them deal with great cosmic battles between gods. You'll read about these forces between gods and beasts, and they wrestle and they fight, and creation is a kind of an afterthought of this massive cosmic showdown. Humanity is often the result of these fallouts. Someone bleeds and falls on the ground, and then a human kind of pops up from that, or they become the subservient slaves to the gods. And there's all these different origin accounts that humanity is just kind of these subservient fallout afterthoughts within their creation accounts. But that's not what the Israelite is teaching us here. He said, there isn't some cosmic showdown between God and God. There isn't this battle between God and beast, and therefore humanity is the fallout. No. The Genesis account is different. He says, God literally created the space for us. For us. If you scroll down and you get to day 6, humanity is the pinnacle of the first 6 days of creation. It's the high point of day 6, of really all 6 days put together. That we were created space for us with purpose and design to function well and for it to sustain us. He created the space for us. Now, imagine Israel standing up in front of all these other cultures where humanity is an afterthought, it's secondary, just primordial blood from some ancient beast. And they get up, no. Our God created space for us, and we live in the space for him and with him. What? That's completely foreign to the ancient Near Eastern perspective. Humanity wasn't an afterthought. They are the pinnacle of the first 6 days. He didn't battle some great beasts. He created the great beasts and then even contains them. You'll see that in the book of Job. I think in the book of Job, you're kind of waiting for God just to show Job who he is. Like, yeah, tell us the meaning of life. And he's like, where were you? Where were you when I created the great beasts of the sea? And you're like, whoa, okay, we're getting a different perspective here. He's talking about how he doesn't fight these great beasts. He created them and he contains them. He is far greater. The Israelite is saying, our God is better than yours. Our God is better than yours because he loves us and he's with us and he's created space for us, whereas your gods don't care about you. How many of you thought of that in the first line of Genesis before? This is the beauty of what we're reading about in these first few lines. And then he continues in verse 2, "In the earth, the land was formless and a desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of those waters." And I want to look at this concept that is translated so many different ways in English, formless and desolate emptiness. Many of you probably have completely different words in that English because it's a really unique Hebrew phrase. It's actually one of my favorites to say. It's tohu vavohu. Can you say that? Tohu vavohu. It's so fun to say. Tohu vavohu. It's a rhyme, right? We're reading a poem here, right? We're reading a poem that they're saying here. Tohu vavohu is a really interesting English phrase that's hard to really capture. But I think the best ways to translate it literally are probably wasteland, non-functioning, non-inhabitable, chaotic dysfunction. The land was uninhabitable wasteland, I think is the best way to understand tohu vavohu. Uninhabitable wasteland, barren and wilderness. The image there is just this barren nothingness that no one can live in. That's the image that we're seeing here with tohu vavohu. In fact, if you looked at 29 other times it's used, we translate it as wasteland or uninhabitable. I don't know why we don't translate it here. Seems odd that we translate it all those other places like this, but not here. I think it's our modern cosmology kind of tweaking it a little bit. But the ancient writer is like, think about barren, wasteland, uninhabitable places to live. You know, we have pictures of this. Look at the Ramon crater in Israel, for example. Like if we were to walk into this, you go, yeah, I don't want to live here. There's nothing here, right? What could survive here? It's hot, it's dry, there's no water, there's no trees. It's uninhabitable. How am I supposed to live here? This is the idea of what an Israelite thinking of tohu vavohu is, this barren wilderness, uninhabited and dysfunctional. It doesn't. What's the purpose of this, right? That's how they would look at that. And you think these are people who understand wilderness, barren land. I mean, they're in the Middle East. They understand what this looks like, and this is their view of it. It's tohu vavohu. It's hard to live in these places. It's a barren, uninhabitable environment. Yet, God is there. Yet, in the deep, dark waters, again, in Israelite culture, the waters were like the scariest place you could ever go. In fact, I get it. I went on a paddle boat one time, and I went too far out, and land disappeared. I thought I was dead. I was like, this is it. Like, you look down, you're like, there's nothing. Like, it's horrifying. Yet, they say, God is there. In the uninhabitable, dysfunctional, barren wilderness, the Spirit of God is there. That is an important point that I want to hit on because it's a common thread throughout the Bible. We have imagery of barren wildernesses and wastelands and dark, ominous waters in this opening line, but they reflect something significant because it's not uninhabitable because God is there. God is there. Genesis 1, this opening line is teaching us that we find environments that are dysfunctional. We will find environments that are barren. We will find seasons of life that are uninhabitable, where life possibly could never sustain itself, yet God is found in it. Think about that. Think about that application in your own life. How many of you have been through experiences that are dysfunctional? How many of you have been through seasons of life that are barren and you feel like you're thirsting and craving for more water? And you go, God, where are you? Well, He's here. The barren, uninhabitable seasons and wildernesses of our life do not prohibit God from being close to us. This is a key point of Genesis 1 and through 2 and 3 as well. That not even in our most dysfunctional, seemingly purposeless places are we ever outside the Spirit of God. Again, a key point in these opening verses. Just that truth alone, you could apply it 100 different ways, and you'd walk out with great knowledge of a good God. Yet we see this thread throughout Scripture again, and especially one of my most favorite passages in the New Testament, which is where Jesus overcomes tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu. If you have the image, again, I'm sorry, yeah, it's a fun word. Mark 1, 12 through 13, it says this about Jesus. At once the Spirit sent him into the wilderness, into the tohu vavohu. And he was in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by Satan. Any Genesis hyperlinks coming to mind as you think about this? He was with the wild animals and the angels attended him. Again, the first thing that Jesus does after his baptism, the origins of his ministry, you could say, his bereshith of his ministry, is to go into an environment that is uninhabitable, dysfunctional, dry, barren, tohu vavohu, where he is tempted by Satan. It's in Genesis 1 through 3, coming back to life. It's as if Jesus is walking into the story of Genesis 1, where the Spirit again is hovering over the waters of dysfunction and uninhabitable wasteland. Yet in this time, it is God in the flesh, being led by that same Spirit that hovered over those deep waters, back into dysfunction. It's there that he is tempted with, to paraphrase it really in three ways, he's tempted with God's provision. Is God going to provide for you in this barren, uninhabitable wasteland? Is God going to protect you in this barren, uninhabitable wasteland? In fact, I'm going to give you power and glory in this uninhabitable wasteland. Does this story seem like it's going to foreshadow something 2 chapters from now? Absolutely. It's so easy to kind of divide Genesis 1 from Genesis 2 and 3 and go, well, these are contradictory accounts. No, the author knows what he's doing here. He's setting up the story for all of Genesis, for all of humanity, based off of God's character and meeting us in wilderness situations, in dysfunction and uninhabitable environments. In fact, Jesus will overcome all of these things, overcome all of the dysfunction, overcome all of the temptation, showing us the meaning of life within humanity and how it is dependent on God. In this desolate, uninhabitable wasteland, with hunger and thirst scorching his physical body, he overcomes what the first humans couldn't do in paradise. He overcomes what the first humans couldn't do in paradise. The temptations of questioning God's provision, protection, and our quest for power and glory, he overcomes those in a barren wasteland, or they're known as tohu vavohu. It was in the dark, barren wasteland that God spoke light. And light, this is that first thread in the scriptures where we see light equaling life. That when God said, let there be light in this dysfunctional, barren wasteland, he said, I'm going to bring life to it. This place that can't inhabit anything, I am bringing life into it. As Jesus went into the wilderness and overcame temptation, he is pointing us to the way of life that is found in Jesus. These connections are so important to us. In Genesis 1, God orders his world to perfection. You look at the first 7 days, God orders his world to perfection. In Genesis 2 and 3, sin brings it back into dysfunction. Mark 1 is that first step in bringing it back into the order of Genesis 1 again. The Bible's not boring to study, is it? This is the fun stuff. This is when it gets really fun to study Scripture. Without evaluating Genesis story through these ancient eyes, we miss these powerful hyperlinks and how Jesus fulfills them. Because how many of you, be honest, thought Genesis 1, Jesus in the wilderness hyperlink? Probably not many of us. I'd be surprised. I didn't know until I started looking at things like this. The Genesis account, once the reader recognizes in the opening lines of its origin, the beginning of everything, that humanity isn't some afterthought of some kind of great cosmic battle or some kind of slave to be used to an unrelatable God, but that he was one who created space for us, that he's with us, and he recognizes the barren dysfunction in this world. Our world was created for us with purpose, where humanity again is the peak of creation in day 6. We are called the image bearers, which we're going to talk about next week, the image bearers of God and what that means in creation. That while there might be tohu vavohu in this world, our God didn't leave us in it. If you hear anything today, think of that. That there's going to be tohu vavohu in this world, but God doesn't leave you in it. He doesn't depart from you in it. He is immersed in it, hovering over the darkness of our world. In Jesus, we see the dysfunction, uninhabitable lands overcome through him. His Spirit hovers over the waters, and a powerful parallel in how His Son went into it for us. The powerful parallels that are found here. And that no matter what uninhabitable situation you find yourself in, there is no place outside of it where our God cannot meet you, where He cannot walk with you, and He's not limited in that regard. So I want you to think about that as we reflect on these opening lines of Genesis 1. And there's just these first 3 verses and what the Israelite is trying to teach us today. Things that are really important to our walk, our relation to God, our character, to our posture to God. All of these things are so important. Just in the opening lines, it sets the base for so much of where the story goes for the next 66 books. Starts in these first lines.